Alcan was generously rewarded for its efforts in the Second World War by the government of Canada. Abel Peters put his life on the line at the beaches of Normandy, fighting for the freedom of this country, and Canada rewarded him by declaring war on his people.
Sometimes I thought it was impossible, to treat another human being, and then I fought World War II to be a free country, they call it. But after what they treat to us like that, it isn't a free country.
The environmental damage from Alcan's Kemano project is incalculable. Char, once a staple of the Cheslatta diet, is practically non-existent in Cheslatta Lake. One used to be able to traverse the Cheslatta stream with a horse. Now it's an ugly open wound, unable to support life. At the western end of Cheslatta Lake, there is now 2 kilometers of silt. The Nechako Reservoir was never cleared of trees prior to filling. Alcan assumed the 80,000 hectares of trees flooded would decay rapidly. They were wrong. The fish now have high levels of mercury in their systems. The flooding also wiped out 800 square kilometers of wildlife habitat, including important breeding grounds and migration routes for caribou, moose, and grizzly bear. The Nechako River is no longer a wild, free-flowing river. Its once natural flows are now regulated by a transnational corporation. There are many rivers in Canada that have already been dammed or diverted, wild rivers altered for all time. And because of their alteration, 60 different indigenous communities have been relocated from their ancestral lands. The people that have chosen to fight are those that have always been directly affected. But non-native peoples are starting to realize that the unnecessary destruction of the earth really isn't progress at all.
I think the people who are standing in the way of, quote, progress, basically of phenomenal corporate greed for profits, are the heroes and heroines of our time.
Dans ma communauté, il y a des gens qui ont été en prison pour le projet, 13% de la population.
Kemano 2, James Bay 2, St. Margaret 3, there should never have been any ones in all of these.
Nothing less than our survival is what's at stake.
I'm going to be here till the end. Alcan will not build Kemano 2 as long as I'm still living.
There's a drop of water on the wall, and the drop's about to fall, and it falls into a trickle, and the trickle is flowing down, down, down to the ground, and the moss begins to grow. Watch, 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 watch the water flow, and watch the current become a stream, busting through the seams, cracking through the concrete, bending down the steel, in a raging that is real, a tearing torrent you can feel the thunder growing, thunder underground, and in my heart, the chains falling apart, the wildness in my soul, and for once in life, I know I'm not alone. For the mountains make our bones, with the oceans in our blood, our feet planted firmly in the mud. We are alive, the burning embers in our eyes, the tingling touch upon our skin. And in the heat of passion we begin to understand that we are of this land, that we are part of Earth, and when it's threatened, we will fight for all we're worth. We watch the dam come crashing down, water rushing to the sea, and now the river, now the river, now the river, now is free. The river is free.
By some miracle, a few salmon runs survived Alcan's Kemano project. After water was re-released into the Nechako River in 1957, it took 20 years for the remnant salmon populations to build themselves up again. But in 1979, Alcan was hooked up to the province's main power grid, which meant that the company could now sell their excess power to BC Hydro. All they had to do was draw off more water from the Nechako.
In about 1981, when the injunction flows around by the Department of Federal Fisheries, I was at my house and a great big Chinook salmon, a tai, as you people in the east know, came down the river in obvious distress out in front of my house, so I swam out and got it, and it was a female fish about 40 pounds, quite a large fish, a big fish with big dorsal fins, a very pretty thing. And I didn't know what was wrong, so I held it upright, and I love fishing, don't get me wrong, I love fishing, and I thought, but I didn't want to see this big fish die, and I held it in my arms for perhaps, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes and righted it, and I thought, maybe it's going to get better and I'll be able to send it on its way, because it was coming up this river going to its spawn, going for its last trip. And it died in my arms. And it had a very profound effect on me, and I never forgot that. Because I thought, who took the river away from that fish, and who had the right to do it?
We have a major argument with Alcan, because it was also stipulated in the 1950 agreement that they could only be allowed to have this water for their aluminum industrial purposes. And this is one thing which we're very, very angry and concerned about, that it was never contemplated that Alcan would be allowed to get into the energy business, now of course extremely lucrative.
By 1980, Alcan was making about $1 million a month in sales to BC Hydro, who in turn was selling the power to the United States. It was then that Alcan decided to announce that it was going to proceed with the second phase of its hydroelectric development, the Kemano completion project. The company planned to build a second tunnel, add more transmission lines to Kitimat, dam the Nanaka, and increase the diversion of the Nechako to 88% of its original flow in order to double the generating capacity of the Kemano power plant. Alcan was already drawing off 70% of the Nechako, and it had caused serious damage to the fish. In 1980, the Department of Fisheries ordered Alcan to increase the flows. When Alcan refused, the department then got a Supreme Court injunction which set a base flow rate sufficient for the Chinook salmon to spawn, and thus began a 7-year argument to determine who really had control over the Nechako.
Alcan has already too much water with Kemano 1, and there certainly should not be, in my opinion, Kemano completion. It is virtually a certainty that the sockeye and Chinook stocks will be reduced to remnants. This will be a disaster for the salmon populations.
Dr. Harold Mundy is a salmon biologist. Back in the early 80s, when he was still working for the Department of Fisheries, he and a colleague were given the task of determining how much water can be taken out of a river without damaging the salmon populations. They did a case history of 80 rivers worldwide. 66 of those rivers gave them quantitative answers, and 29 of them were relevant to the problems facing the Nanaka and Nechako rivers, and they formulated some guidelines based on their findings.
The abstraction of water should follow the seasonal pattern of natural flows, because this is what the salmon populations have become adapted to over the course of many centuries. And that in addition to following the natural seasonal pattern, no more than 30% of the water should be abstracted per month, and none at all at times of very low flows when the fish are probably in danger in natural circumstances.
The natural conditions of the Nechako River have already been altered drastically because of Kemano 1. Decreasing the flow of a river increases its temperature. Add to this the fact that the world is heating up at a phenomenal rate, and river conditions start to become lethal for salmon. Cornelius Groot is a salmon biologist who has studied extensively the effect that global warming is having on salmon species. According to Dr. Groot, the last thing we should be doing is taking more water out of the Nechako.
Each shackle in the chain needs to be intact. If temperatures are too high in certain stretches, the fish may not migrate through or may wait. There is some information to indicate that if they do migrate through at high temperatures, diseases develop. And they really have to move into colder waters pretty quickly after that to resolve that. So there are a number of factors indicating that high temperatures are really bad for salmon.
In 1987, after DFO and Alcan still hadn't reached a decision over flow rates, Alcan ordered a trial. Harold Mundy was to have been an expert witness for the department.
I had submitted a draft expert witness statement, and I was asked to alter that. And I found that I couldn't do that on the basis of scientific evidence.
Dr. Mundy was consequently dropped as a witness. Suddenly, after only a week of the trial, an out-of-court settlement was reached. Closeted in a room for 4 days, officials from the Department of Fisheries, Alcan, and the BC government struck a deal known as the 1987 Settlement Agreement. Under the deal, Alcan would have to give up plans to dam the Nanaca, but it kept control of the Nechako. The department had given Alcan the very flows which they had taken them to court over, claiming that mitigative measures would save the day.
And what the 1987 settlement agreement did was take those water flows, which were not acceptable at that stage, and add to them all of the tools that have been developed in the habitat management policy, and add a third element which says Alcan is obligated to provide the water, add all those tools, which they have to pay for, and thirdly, they still can't walk away from it. They still can't say, there's your package, do with it as you wish, and if it doesn't work, too bad. That's not it. What Alcan has signed on for is an obligation to make sure that that program works.
The claim of the settlement agreement was that these flows plus mitigative measures would do the trick. And I don't know any biologist or scientist acquainted with this problem other than those who signed the agreement who would concur with that claim. The mitigative measures were supposed to be based on proven and practical techniques, and in fact these measures have never been tried on a river the size of the Nechako or on an interior river.